Okay, so this lecture is on surplus, which is the benefit that people get from trade or exchange. And specifically the benefit that they get over what they paid. So I'll start with a little example. We are coming up right now on 1 year of lockdown, right? Um, and one of the things that we did during the first few months of quarantine at my house is I've got an old Jeep. I like Jeeps. I like old cars too. So I've got a nice old Jeep that I was just like, kids, you're 11, 12, 13 years old. You're old enough to learn to drive. And so we went on driving lessons. And we live out in the country. And so they can drive around in fields and in the woods. And it was a great time to just like practice or like learn to drive a standard transmission. My 12-year-old daughter can do a damn good job with that. I'm very impressed. Um, uh, and, and so it was great fun. And that's still what we do, especially when the weather gets nice like this. Um, so when that happened, I was like, this is the best money that I ever spent, was picking up this old Jeep so we could have fun. Okay? That idea of like this was worth every penny I paid for it. That's or like or that was money well spent. That's what we call in economics surplus. Okay, that value you get above what you pay for something. Um, on the side of consumers. So again, this is the value, or let me say the benefit above what benefit above the cost. How's that? Okay, we call it surplus. Okay, so you know, I yeah, and when it comes to surplus, there are really two sides of the market. So we talk about them. There's surplus to the buyer, and there's surplus to the seller. Um, okay, now more specifically in markets, often we talk about consumer surplus. When it's a market for a good, it's consumer surplus versus producer surplus. Often those are the terms you'll hear. Um, uh, or what else? When it's a labor market, the buyers are employers, the sellers of labor are workers. Okay, so again, we'll talk about surplus for both sides of the market. Let me do another example, kind of a hypothetical example. Imagine that I need to have my yard mowed, and it would be worth $12 to me to have my yard mowed. Um, okay, so on the other side of the market, there's a neighbor kid who would be willing to mow my yard, and that kid's time is worth like $5 to them. That's where they feel it's worth working. Now, if I offer them $5 or more, they're like, yeah, I'll take the job. If I offer them anything less than five, they're like, forget it, it's not worth my time. Okay, so that $5 is kind of what it's worth to them just to break even in terms of happiness. Okay, so here's someone, the value of their time is $5. Here's me, the value of having a mowed lawn is $12. We could reach an agreement where I offer to pay this person $10 to mow my lawn. And that's mutually beneficial. I pay $10 for a service that's worth $12 to me, so I get some value from that. Uh, for the person supplying the labor, their time is worth $5. They're getting $10. Heck, that's a good deal for them too. So both of us are happy with the exchange. It's mutually beneficial. And that extra value we get is our surplus. Okay, so having given those examples, I'm going to go into more of a model. And I'm going to revive some people from an earlier example. Remember, there's the market for hamburgers, and people like Ann, Bob, and Chris and Dan were all interested in possibly buying a hamburger. And Ann gets a lot of happiness from hamburgers. Um, okay, so forth. Like Ann, she would be willing to give up to $10 for a hamburger. And if a hamburger is worth $10 to her, like she loves that delicious hamburger and she's super hungry, and she can get it for less, like if someone charges her just $6 for it, that's surplus to her. Okay, so I'm going to go through this and think about the surplus to each consumer, and then also the total surplus to consumers in the market. So that's what we call consumer surplus. Okay. Okay. So let's imagine that the price of hamburgers is, let me do $6. Okay. Now the price is important in surplus. It's like, surplus is the extra value you get above what you paid. So what you paid is important. Okay, if the price is $6, then Ann, her surplus is $10 of value to her minus the $6 she pays, gives her $4 of surplus. For Bob, it's worth $9, pays $6, gives $3 of surplus. For Chris, $8 of value minus minus $6 that Chris pays is $2 of surplus. Same for Dan. Okay, Emma and Felix, $7 of value, pays $6, and so they get $1 of surplus. Okay, now George, Henry, and Iris, they would be willing to buy the hamburger. It's got $6 of value to them. They pay $6, but they kind of break even in terms of happiness. They don't get any extra surplus. Okay, so $0 of surplus. Okay, but then when we come to the next four, Jane and Chris and Larry and Mary, if they purchased this, they would be worse off purchasing it than not. They would get $5 of value and pay $6, so end up with negative $1 of surplus. I think of this as like buyer's remorse, right? If these four, again, Jane, Kristen, Larry, and Mary, if they buy the item, they're going to realize that they paid more than it's worth, okay? Buyer's remorse. But if everyone's rational, these four don't buy the item when the price is $6. And so the people who do purchase it are the first, I think it's 9. And total consumer surplus, right, CS, consumer surplus is $4 for Ann, plus $3 for Bob, plus $2 for Chris, and $2 for Dan, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, okay, plus some zeros, and that comes out to something. 11 plus 3, I think it's 14. $14 of surplus. in the market as a whole. So that's total consumer surplus in the market. All right. Now, a reason why we care about consumer surplus is when we analyze policies and some other changes in markets, we might be interested in knowing whether a policy increases or reduces surplus to one side of the market. Now, later on, we will encounter monopolies. And something we might want to know is whether regulating a monopolist, regulating the price the monopolist can charge, does that increase consumer surplus? Which is another way of saying it increases the well-being, the happiness of consumers. It benefits consumers overall. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That's why we care about this like total consumer surplus on one side of the market or the other. Total consumer surplus. The other side of the market is producer surplus. Producer surplus will be similar to profit. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I next want to think about what the consumer surplus looks like in a graph. Okay, so the consumer surplus when the price of hamburgers is $4. I want to show that it's a particular area of this graph. And it's approximately the same as the area above the price of $6 and below the demand curve out to the quantity purchased. I think at this price, the quantity purchased would be 9. Okay. Okay. So let me show you all how that works. So Anne gets $4 of surplus. Remember, that's her value, $10 minus the price she pays, $6. Well, if I do a little rectangle right here, this rectangle I just drew, what's the height of that rectangle? 4, yeah. Even like specifically, it's $10 minus 6, right? $4. And the width of it, the width is 1 because there's only one person buying at that price. So the width is 1, and that represents just Anne. Now the second point here, like that point, that really comes from Bob's joining the market. So this rectangle right here, the height of that rectangle is 9 minus 6. Okay, and the width is 1. Okay, there's one person who pays that. Okay, so, if we want to put down numbers, the first rectangle is a 4, the second is a 3. Okay, now here is the next area. Okay, this is a height of 8 minus 6. And the width of that actually goes from 2 to 4. The width of that is 2, and it comes from the fact that it's both Chris and Dan who are joining the market at that point. So here's another rectangle. I guess technically it's a square, 2 by 2 square. I am not an artist, as I've said many times. That does not look very square to me. Okay, but it's 2 by 2. And so that's like adding in Chris and Dan, okay? Then we have 2 people who get $1 of surplus. So that's this next rectangle, $1 of surplus. for 2 people. I suppose you could kind of say there's another rectangle right here, which is $0 of surplus for 3 people. Okay. It's a totally flat rectangle without any area. But anyhow, these kind of fill in that area below the demand curve and above the price. In fact, that will always be the area for consumer surplus. Okay, well, or let me tell you what is always the area for consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price paid by consumers paid by consumers. Okay, now I've lost my colors. Okay, so below the demand curve, above the price, as far out as the quantity consumed. Okay, often it will be kind of a triangle area. And I'll show you all that in just a second. Okay, here. Generally, when we're in a market, so like let me move past that one example and think more generally. When we're talking about a market for something and we want to graph this consumer surplus, as I said, it's the area above the price and below the demand curve, as far out as the quantity purchased. So when the price is P, people will want to purchase Q. So it's the area inside this kind of triangle. I'll call it a triangle, even though the demand curve is not a perfect line. Okay, so we're here. I've shaded in the same thing. That area is consumer surplus. Now, I'm going to flip to the other side of the market, producer side of the market. Okay, and for this producer, I'm going to think, as is usually the case, like what determines the price, what determines the price at which a producer is willing to sell a hamburger is their cost. Okay, so that really motivates the supply curve. Again, the cost of manufacturing the hamburger. My hamburger company, if we can make a hamburger for $5, we are willing and able to sell you a hamburger if the price is $5 or more. Okay. Now, if the market is offering $8 for a hamburger and I can produce one for $5, there's profit for me, right? My profit is $3, or as we're calling it right now, surplus. Producer surplus. Producer surplus is very similar to profit. Got it? Okay. So imagine in this market, the price of a hamburger is $9. Okay. And then think about the surplus that each of these companies would get. The surplus is what they get from selling it, which is $9 minus the cost of manufacturing it. Okay, so firm A can manufacture a hamburger for $3. If hamburgers are selling for $9, the surplus they get is $6. 9 minus 3. Firm B, if they sell a hamburger at $9, they're making $4 of surplus. Right? $9 that they get from selling it minus the $5 cost. Same for firm C. Firm D gets $2 of surplus. Hang on. Let me pause for just a second. Okay, I'm good. Then, same for firm D, E, and F, they are getting $2 of surplus. Firm H, I, and J can manufacture a hamburger for $9. If the market has a price of $9, they break even on that. So receive $5 from selling it. Cost of producing it is $9. So they make nothing. The remaining firms, if they produced a hamburger, they'd produce it at a loss, or they'd sell it at a loss. Like firm J, it could produce a hamburger and sell it. It would receive $9 from selling the hamburger. It would cost $11 to produce it. So the profit would be negative $2. Negative $2, negative $2, and then negative $4. Okay. Now again, if everyone's being rational, these last four firms do not produce. Because it would be unprofitable for them to try to produce and sell. But these others, they do. And they make surplus. And again, surplus for a producer is similar to the idea of profit. And let me go off on a little side note. What you think of as profit is what we call more generally surplus. Now, surplus is an awkward term, and I hate this fact that surplus means two very different things in economics. Surplus can mean that quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Okay, that is what I prefer to call excess supply. Okay, so like when a minimum wage is set above the competitive market wage, then there are more workers looking for jobs than jobs are available. There's an excess supply of workers. Okay, in plain language, a surplus. But as I said, surplus has these two meanings in economics that are totally unconnected. So I don't like to use surplus in that way. The other definition of surplus is that it is the benefit above the cost. Okay. And that's how we're using it today. Okay. I probably should have gone into this like linguistic note at the start of the lecture to be clear. Today, that's the only thing that surplus means. And when we say there's consumer surplus, that means consumers are getting more benefit than what they pay. Okay. When we say producer surplus, it again means that producers are getting more benefit, more revenue than what they pay, their costs, which is essentially profit. Okay, so total producer surplus in this market, it's $6 plus $4. No. Oh, there's a mistake here. This value should have been come on, erase. This value should have been 4. Yeah. Okay. 6 plus 4 plus 4 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. So for the first 9 firms, each of them makes some money, and that adds up to 14 plus 6, I think $20 is the total producer surplus in this market. Okay. Next, graphing, as I did before. There is an area of this graph that represents producer surplus, and when the price is goodness, I've already forgotten. What was it on the last page? I was doing the price was 9. Okay. Okay. Then the producer surplus. Wait, 9? Okay. So the producer surplus is everything below the price and above the supply curve as far out as the quantity sold. So if the price is 9, the quantity sold will also be 9. Okay. But again, it's this area between the price and the supply curve. And I'll go through the same explanation of that. Like firm A. Firm A was able to produce a hamburger at a cost of $3 and sell it at a price of $9. So the surplus is 3, but the surplus is 6. That's 9 minus 3. So this point right here on the demand curve really comes from firm A, and this rectangle that I've drawn, this has a height which is 9 minus 3, and a width of 1. And basically that rectangle there comes from the fact that there's one firm that would sell it at $9 and the cost is $3. That's what generates this rectangle. And then there's a rectangle right here with a height of 9 minus 5 equals 4, and a width of 2. Okay, and that comes from the fact that there are 2 firms, B and C, that would receive $9 of revenue from selling a hamburger. They can produce a hamburger at a cost of $5, and so it gives them $4 of surplus. And then the next rectangle is like a height of 9 minus 7, a width of 3. That comes from the fact that there are 3 firms that can sell a hamburger for $9 that they produce at a cost of $7. Okay, and so all of this area for the different firms fills in that, or all these rectangles for the different firms fill in that area, approximately fill in that area below the price down to the supply curve. Um, okay, and as far out as the quantity sold, 9. Okay, so here's the general rule for the area representing producer surplus. Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. Okay. As far out as the quantity sold. Okay. That that explanation always works for producer surplus. Often it'll look like kind of a triangle in a picture. So here's sort of the general scenario. When we graph consumer surplus, there's a market, there's a supply curve, upward sloping supply curve. If the price in the market is P, then the quantity that would be sold is Q, and producer surplus is everything below the price and above the supply curve, okay, as far out as the quantity sold. Okay, so I've gone from like this story about how much it costs different firms to produce to like the general thing. Most of the time we'll be doing our analysis in graphs, and an important thing to know is that area, again, below the price, above the supply curve, as far out as the quantity sold, that measures the surplus, essentially profits to producers. Okay. Then for a market, when we put these two things together, when the market is in equilibrium, there's a supply curve, there's a demand curve. Market equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. There is a market equilibrium price of P, and at a price of P, quantity demanded and quantity supplied are both Q. Okay, and the area of consumer surplus is above the price up to the demand curve. The area of producer surplus is below the price down to the supply curve. It's these two triangles. This is like the standard picture for surplus in a perfectly competitive market. And this is often our benchmark for evaluating a policy or something like a policy. It's like, well, if the market were in equilibrium, here is what consumer surplus would be and producer surplus would be. What would happen if something were to change? What would happen to the area of consumer surplus? Or what would happen to the area of producer surplus? All right, I'm going to do one of those examples now. I want to talk about the impact of a minimum wage on surplus of the two sides of the market. Now, in this case, the suppliers are the workers, and the demanders of labor are employers. So I'll refer to the areas as worker surplus and employer surplus. Again, they measure the extra value that everyone gets from a transaction. Think of the example that I gave y'all of me hiring a neighbor to mow my lawn. We both get some benefit from that transaction. It's mutually beneficial. We both get more value than the cost to us, to each of us. And that's surplus for both of it. I am the employer. The task was worth $12 to me. I paid $10 for it, so I get $2 of surplus. The neighbor is the worker. The neighbor gets $10 of cash and gave up time that was worth $5 to them. So they get $5 of surplus. That's what's going on. And those are areas, like in a graph, those are the areas that I described earlier. In fact, here are the areas of employer surplus and worker surplus when the market is in equilibrium. Got it? Market is in equilibrium at a wage of W star, and at that wage of W star, the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are both E star. Okay. So now, let's suppose there is a minimum wage placed in the market. And the government mandates that workers must be paid at least W bar. Okay, now, at a wage of W bar, let me remind you all, the number of people who want jobs is, we can follow across to the supply curve, number of workers who want jobs is ES. Okay. The number of employers who are willing to hire workers, we go across from W bar to the demand curve, and that is ED. Okay. Now, the number of workers who want jobs is irrelevant. If employers are willing to hire only ED workers, if that's the number of jobs that employers are willing to offer, that's the number of workers who find jobs. It's irrelevant how many want to find jobs. Okay, so when there is this minimum wage, employment is ED. And now, I'm going to identify the portions of the graph that represent surplus to each side of the market. Give me a second, let me pause. Okay, I gave a definition of employer surplus. Employer surplus, again, that's the demand side of the market, is everything below the demand curve and above the price that they pay. So below the demand curve and above the price as far out as the quantity that they purchase, the amount of labor employed. So this area that I've shaded in pink, that is the demander's surplus, the buyer's surplus, in this case, employer's surplus. Okay. Workers get surplus, the suppliers get surplus, and their surplus is everything below the price down to the supply curve as far out as the quantity sold. Okay, so it's this area right here that represents the worker surplus. Okay. The surplus to one side of the market, the surplus is the area between the demand and supply curves as far out as the quantity sold. The supply side of the market gets the portion that's closer to the supply curve. The demand side of the market gets the portion closer to the demand curve. I hope that makes sense. So if you're trying to keep track of what surplus area belongs to whom, everyone gets a surplus closer to their curve. The ones supplying labor, those are workers. So here I've drawn that graph more neatly. Employer surplus at the top, worker surplus at the bottom. Now I want to next compare that to surplus in the competitive market. And this is going to be important for answering questions of, does the policy benefit someone? Are minimum wages good for workers? That's a matter of, has the area of worker surplus increased or decreased? Are minimum wages good for employers? Again, that's a matter of whether the area for employer surplus has increased or decreased. So let me flip between the market with a minimum wage, and in just a second I'm going to flip to the market without a minimum wage, and you can watch what happens to those areas. Okay, with the minimum wage, with no minimum wage. Okay. So much bigger area of employer surplus without the minimum wage. The worker surplus area has changed shapes. So let me go back. Okay, employer surplus has shrunk. Here, and it's going to get a little bit messy, but I'm going to try to draw here, remind you all of what would have happened in equilibrium. In equilibrium, surplus went out as far as Q star. It was everything between the demand curve and the supply curve that far out. Okay, employer surplus was everything below the demand curve and above this market equilibrium wage of W star. Come on. Okay, so this area was all employer surplus, sort of marked in green right now. With the minimum wage, the area of employer surplus shrinks to just the orange area. It's clear, completely and totally clear, that employer surplus is smaller with the minimum wage than in the market equilibrium. Okay, so, right? Completely clear, no doubt about that. And so that means that employers lose money. Okay, employers' profits go down due to the minimum wage. Now, on the worker side of the market, things are not quite so simple. Okay. In equilibrium, worker surplus was everything below W star down to the supply curve as far out as the market equilibrium Q star. With the minimum wage, it's this different area, this blue area. Okay, so workers have gained one area of surplus. Okay, so workers have gained this area, and they have lost this area of surplus. Okay. So they've lost some surplus because workers are being disemployed. Okay. Some workers have lost their jobs. So as I said again, disemployed. These are jobs that would have existed in a competitive market, but disappear due to the minimum wage. Remember that neighbor who could mow my lawn for $10. Okay? If the government comes along and says, thou shalt not hire someone to mow your lawn for less than $15, then it's not worth my paying someone to mow the lawn. $12, that was okay. But if the price goes above $12, forget it. I'll just mow it myself. Okay? So at a price of $15, I'm not going to employ that person. And that person is going to lose the surplus that they would have had. Okay? And that's what this area of loss is. Loss due to disemployment. Jobs that disappear due to the minimum wage. Okay, now the workers who keep their jobs get paid more, and that's this area of gains. Okay, so whether workers benefit overall, well, whether workers benefit overall, like really, worker benefit overall, that is the same thing as saying whether worker surplus increases. Okay. Whether worker surplus increases depends on how large the disemployment is. Disemployment relative to the wage increase. Yeah. Now, just to change things a little bit, like I've been presenting this question as if or like presenting the scenario with a neighbor mowing my lawn as if the minimum wage would be bad. That would be true of a minimum wage of $15. However, if the minimum wage were set at $11, the neighbor would still have the job and be getting more money for doing the same job. That's this blue rectangle here. You poor people in the classroom, this projector does such a poor job with colors. Um, I know it's kind of hard to read that and distinguish some of the colors. Anyhow, these gains are from the people who keep their jobs getting paid more. Anyhow, minimum wages. I can say clearly they will reduce profits to employers. Whether workers benefit depends on like how large the change in quantity demanded is, right? This disemployment, that's the change in quantity demanded relative to the change in wage. Okay. Oh, hang on. The relative sizes of change in quantity and change in price. Does that ring a bell? Okay, hint. It should ring a bell. It should be close to something that we talked about on Tuesday. Do you remember what elasticity was about? The percentage change in quantity demanded relative to the percentage change in price. And that's actually what's going on in this picture. Like, as I said, the whether workers benefit depends on how large disemployment is, the change in quantity demanded, relative to the change in the price of labor. If the change in quantity demanded is small and is small relative to the change in wage, then worker surplus increases. But this is the same thing as saying that labor demand is inelastic. Okay. So if demand for labor is inelastic, then worker surplus will increase. That's a key thing. Okay. That is, in fact, important. The elasticity of demand for labor will determine whether workers benefit from a higher minimum wage. And it's possible that workers do benefit overall if demand is inelastic, but it's also possible that the minimum wage can hurt workers overall if there is a large disemployment, if many jobs are lost and only a few workers get a higher wage, right? A large change in quantity demanded for the change in wage, that means demand is elastic. Okay, so I hope you all are learning something about the minimum wage. Part of the goal here is to teach you all a little bit about a real economic application, the minimum wage. And so, I've addressed employers' profits, essentially, workers' surplus, and there's actually a third side to this transaction that sometimes we forget about. Now, I brought up another example. Sorry, I'm bouncing sometimes from one example to another example. I brought up something on Tuesday, which is some of the faculty at Elon are unionizing. We're going to march down to our employers and demand higher wages. Okay. Now, as an economist, I say, well, there's going to be a reduction in employment. University has a fixed budget for the most part. It's not exactly a profit-maximizing business, but it has a fixed budget. And if the cost of labor goes up, something else has to give. Okay? And maybe they cut back on landscaping on campus. That would be a shame. Rachel's shaking her head please no, it's too gorgeous. Okay, this is a pretty campus, and by the way, especially in spring, you first-year students, this is your first spring on campus. Hell, even you sophomores, this is your first spring on campus. March through May is the time to be in Carolina. Okay, but going back to this, this topic of unionizing. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, and that's the problem I see as an economist. That it's inevitable that the university will be able. It's inevitable that the university must reduce employment somewhere, so some jobs will be lost. Of course, there's a little bit of a way that the university can absorb higher wages paid to faculty without cutting positions. What is that other part? Or what is the way they can do it? Have a higher labor bill, but they don't want to cut jobs or any other expenses. They can make up for it by... What's that? Say that again? Raising tuition. Exactly. Okay, you all. Okay. And this is the third side of the market. Often when I think about these policy applications, I think there are really three sides of the market we have to think about. There's the employer, there are the workers, and there are the customers. So I'm going to do that third side of the market as well. And think about how does a minimum wage impact the well-being of customers? So let's suppose this company or there's a firm that produces widgets using minimum wage labor, and the minimum wage goes up. How does that impact consumers of widgets? Okay, and I'm going to do the analysis as like looking at areas of surplus. Let me come back up here and address one other thing before I go into the consumer side of the market. I'll clean up this picture a little bit. Okay, and I'll point out a final thing. There is more total surplus in the market when the market was in equilibrium. What? System's shutting down? No, you're not. Okay. When the market was in equilibrium, the total surplus between between employers and workers was everything between the demand curve and supply curve as far out as that point where they intersect. Okay, with the minimum wage, the area of surplus is only this orange triangle and this blue triangle. Okay, so what about this remaining area over here? This surplus in this area, that just disappears. The policy destroys that surplus. And again, let's think of this neighbor who could mow my lawn. Like, it would have been beneficial to both of us if the neighbor were allowed to mow my lawn. Neighbor would have gotten surplus, I would have gotten surplus. But with the minimum wage in place, I would not be able to employ that worker, and I would, and neither of us would get that benefit. Okay, that surplus just disappears from the market. There's a name for this: loss of surplus due to a market distortion. It's called deadweight loss. Okay, it's a loss of surplus, as I said, due to a distortion in the market. What has been distorted? In this case, it's the employment decision due to distortion by a policy. The minimum wage was not intended to change employment levels. It was intended to just redistribute money between employers and employees. But in the process, it changed employers' hiring decisions. It distorted hiring decisions. And when it did that, it resulted in a loss of surplus overall. Our term for that is deadweight loss. Okay. Often it will be the case that policies that impacting the market will create deadweight loss. Oh, shoot. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Let me come back to this example. Okay, sorry. And this picture, I've labeled that area of deadweight loss. Okay? Often when it shows up in a picture, the deadweight loss will be a triangle area between the quantity that actually gets sold with the policy and the quantity that would have been sold in equilibrium. Okay, usually the deadweight loss is the triangle between those two. It'll show up in other applications. Now, I think I'm ready to talk about the consumer side of the market. Yeah, okay, so here's impact of the minimum wage on the widget market. Okay, so setting up my market for widgets, price of widgets, quantity. Okay, there is some supply of widgets. That comes from the firm that uses minimum wage type labor. Then there's also some demand for widgets that comes from consumers. Okay. Then, where am I? Now, let me say without the minimum wage, prior to the minimum wage, the market is in equilibrium. There's a price P star paid for widgets. The quantity sold is Q star. Okay. Okay. And then the areas of surplus in this market. Again, this is with no minimum wage. Producer surplus, that's everything below the price and above the supply curve, as far out as the quantity sold, Q star. The consumer surplus is everything between consumer's demand curve and the price, as far out as the quantity sold. So that's this area. Okay, again, here first I'm thinking about the market without a minimum wage. Consumer surplus is this blue triangle. Then we raise the minimum wage, or the government raises the minimum wage. It does not directly intervene in this market, but the policy does have an impact on this market. It will shift around a curve in the market. So we have these examples where something changes in the market, it shifts a demand curve or a supply curve, and the market finds a new equilibrium. We talked about these examples a couple weeks ago. Okay, the minimum wage will change a curve in the market, and we want to see what happens in the new equilibrium. Okay, now let's see. How exactly does it change the curves in the market? Well, we have to think about this. It impacts either the demand side of the market or the supply side of the market. Okay, let's see. The minimum wage. Well, we're talking about it's really impacting we're talking about the impact through the effect on producers. This is a company that uses minimum wage labor to produce widgets. So it's something impacting the supply side of the market. And I told you all some things that will shift around the supply curve, right? Like improvements in technology will shift the supply curve. Number of sellers in the market will shift the supply curve. One of the things on that list was the cost of input. Like if the price of an input goes up, if the price of an input into production goes up, it will shift the supply curve to the left. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Okay. And that's what's going to happen in our analysis. Okay, we had an old market equilibrium where the original supply curve intersected the demand curve. This minimum wage will change the supply curve. It'll shift the supply curve to the left. This is a reduction in supply. Okay. And the way to think of this is maybe at any particular price. So let's just pick this price P. The quantity that a firm is willing and able to produce has gone down. So at this price of P, prior to the minimum wage, the firm would produce Q1. But because the cost of labor has increased, after the minimum wage goes up, the firm is willing to produce whatever this is, Q2. I'm tracing down from the new supply curve. Q2, because prices of production have increased, the producer will sell fewer at any price. So that's a reduction in demand. I'm sorry, that's a reduction in shifting the supply curve to the left. Then the market finds a new equilibrium. Equilibrium occurs where the new supply curve intersects the demand curve. So the new supply curve, this yellow one, intersects the demand curve at this point. The new market equilibrium price for widgets is P prime, and the quantity sold is Q prime. Now, as a reference point, remember the equilibrium without the minimum wage was this point. And so the price was lower and a larger quantity was sold. Okay. Impact on the widget market. Okay, surplus. Okay, producer surplus is still the area below the price. So now the price is P prime down to producer supply curve as far out as the quantity sold, Q prime. Okay, so I'm using a consistent definition of like producer surplus. Consumer surplus, everything below their demand curve and above the price as far out as the quantity sold, Q prime. So it's this blue triangle. So these are the areas of surplus with the minimum wage. And I want to go back and compare that to the market without the minimum wage. Okay. In particular, I want to think about the surplus of the consumers. Okay. Without the minimum wage, the market was in equilibrium right here. Quantity sold was Q star. The price paid was P star. And consumer surplus was everything between the demand curve and P star. So all of this distance between the demand curve and P star as far out as the quantity that was sold, Q star. Okay, so do you recognize this kind of greenish triangle that I'm shading right now? That was consumer surplus without the minimum wage. This blue triangle is consumer surplus with the minimum wage. Here, a simplified version of it. All of this area, all of this triangle was consumer surplus without a minimum wage. Once minimum wage was introduced, it raised the cost of producing widgets, which resulted in shifting the supply curve to the left. Widgets become more expensive. That's the increase in the price of widgets. And consumers want to purchase fewer widgets. That's the reduction in quantity. Okay. The area of consumer surplus shrinks. Consumers are buying fewer widgets and they are paying a higher cost for the ones they purchase. Overall, this hurts consumers. Okay. And like again, just comparing the area of surplus without the minimum wage to the area of surplus with the minimum wage, that answers the question of, are consumers better with the minimum wage than without? And the answer is probably not surprising. The minimum wage has a negative impact on consumers of this good. Again, it raises the cost of the good they're purchasing, and fewer consumers are willing to purchase it. Both of those things hurt consumers. Okay, so so to address like the other issue I brought up, unionization of faculty. Okay, faculty unionize, they go down to the university administration and demand higher wages. Okay, this is something that will possibly raise the workers' well-being, correct? Depends on the elasticity of demand for professors, but it's bad for the employer. It cuts into the employer's surplus. And it's bad for consumers, customers. Okay, yeah. Higher tuition, and then fewer students can afford to go here. So, does that like help help the example click in your minds and understand like what surplus and this analysis is addressing? Okay. Now, I brought up an issue that is complex. I'm trying not to really take sides in this and acknowledge that everyone has a different interest, okay? Clearly, I'm on the side of pay me more money, but also let me keep my job. Though, I mean, I'm honest that, either jobs are lost or they pass on the cost to you all. And like unionized faculty are going to result in like reduction in consumer surplus. Okay, so having done all this, I think it's about 15 minutes before I typically would end class. But this was, right? I have 15 more minutes? Okay, should I start a new topic? The next topic I want to do is immigration. No, Rachel doesn't want to know about immigration. Okay, immigration is another interesting topic. I'm not going to do immigration today. You all can start packing your stuff up. I'm at a good stopping point before the exam, but I mean, immigration is going to be another interesting topic that is complex, and we can talk about who benefits from and who is hurt by immigration. I think that's a useful discussion on its own, but it's also a nice way to apply these techniques that we've used. So I'll do immigration at a later time for you all. Okay, but again, I'm done with the lecture. I'm going to go and talk to people on Zoom.